What's up, everybody? Welcome to this episode of the Adapted Lens Live. Today I want to talk a little bit about filters, why you need them, why you may not need them, which ones are worth spending some money on and which ones aren't. So I did a couple of quick trips out to the field, took a couple of pictures. So let's just dive right in. So the first photo I'm going to take is going to be my camera set at ISO 100 with no ND filter. Yields me about a 1/200th of a second shot at f11. Okay, so that one was that first picture that I took, and we're going to hop over to Lightroom and I will show you that picture. So that's this picture right here. Straightforward, as I said in the video, ISO 100, 24 millimeters at f11 at 1/200th of a second. Nothing particularly outstanding. You can see I probably didn't do a great job leveling the camera, but it's relatively sharp, relatively clean, nothing too terribly exciting there. But my whole goal for this photo was actually to do a long exposure. So instead of just taking a simple click, I did this. Then I'm going to screw this on. This is a neutral density filter. In fact, this is a 12-stop neutral density filter, meaning that it reduces the amount of light hitting my sensor by 12 full stops. Now, to get the exact same exposure, I'm now exposing at f11 on ISO 100 for a full 30 seconds. And so as you can see, that's this picture right here. It's a 30-second exposure at ISO 100 still. Same scene, basically. We had a fairly windy day, so you can see the clouds are kind of moving across the sky. And the idea here was really to get kind of a blurred motion shot. Also smooth out the water. We had a lot of people walking on the trail. And so you can see the ND filter kind of did a good job, although you can see there's a little bit of a motion blur there. Somebody must have been fairly well lit by the sun to catch that blur. But the water looks fairly smooth 30 seconds in. It's fairly well exposed, probably about as well as the original shot. I guess the big difference for me is with an ND filter, especially an ND filter of this strength, it doesn't really give you much more than say 30 seconds. So I realized I wasn't actually showing the picture. So yeah, this is the picture here. You can see there's a few images, or a little bit of motion blurring right there. The trees, of course, are a little blurred because it's windy, and so is the clouds, and that was kind of the idea, was to blur some of the clouds. It did a decent job. It's ISO 100, so it's nice and clean. But the problem with this is that if I wanted more than 30 seconds, it doesn't really matter how dark that ND filter is. There's a 12-stop filter. 30 seconds is kind of pushing it. I could stop down the aperture a little bit more and get a little bit beyond 30 seconds, but I've found that basically in normal daylight, the most I can really push out of my camera is about 1:30. Beyond that, I start bottoming out and getting overexposed highlights, and that's really what I want to avoid. Yes, I could stack filters, but that adds a whole new level of difficulty. And so instead, what about doing this? But what if we could not use a neutral density filter? That neutral density filter cost me just about $100, which isn't too bad in the realm of photography, but what if I could save you that $100? So lastly, once again, the camera with no filter at ISO 100, f11 at 1/200th of a second. But instead of taking one photo, what if I were to take dozens or even hundreds of photos? And so that is these 115 photos. In Lightroom, I have them grouped in a stack. So this is this stack right here. You can see there are 115 photos in the stack. And really, it's pretty straightforward what you're doing when you're editing photos like this. So these are the 115 photos. I would right-click in Lightroom. And after I made my adjustments, which I didn't do in this particular instance, but if I were to make adjustments first in Lightroom, make sure the photos are all synced across, and then open them as layers in Photoshop, which I've already done because it does take a little while. And so you can see in Photoshop, these are all 115 layers. It's quite a few. And so again, it's a pretty simple process to sort of simulate what a long exposure ND filter would do. You can take as many photos as you like. Remember that the more photos you take, the longer it's going to take to process because it just takes a while. I have a pretty new computer here, and it still took 6 or 7 minutes for it to all actually load into a stack the way I wanted it to. So I'm moving over from Lightroom. You do that over to here, and now you're in Photoshop. You have all these photos. You select them all, and then you go to Layer, smart objects, and convert to smart object. And that's the process that really does take quite a while. It's compiling all those images into a single smart object. And once it does that, then you're going to go back to smart objects. And we've already done that here. You go to Layer, Smart Objects, and then Stack Mode. And you want to change the stack mode to mean. Again, I didn't do this live because it does take a while and no one wants to watch paint dry. But once you do that mean stacking, you can see you get nice smooth motion in the clouds. All of the people walking along the trails have disappeared. The water looks nice and smooth. It really does emulate pretty perfectly a long exposure using an ND filter. However, without any of the real big downsides. First off, you don't have to pay, somewhere around $100 for a good quality ND filter. 2, you don't have to worry about flare and all the other issues with having an extra piece of glass in front of your lens. 3, if your filter is dirty, you're going to end up with extra artifacts, and it's real hard to keep a filter like that clean. They just always seem to be fingerprint magnets or dust magnets, always constantly wiping down the filter. So it's a really simple, easy way to get a long exposure. This works pretty much perfectly every single time, as long as you make sure you don't move the camera. So of course this needs to be on a tripod. That is a requirement for this method. And so once you're done with that, you go back from Photoshop back into Lightroom, and boom, you have yourself a long exposure. You can take as few or as many photos as you want. So in that case, I took 115 photos, basically one right after the other. If you have darker skies or a darker image, you can take fewer photos because each exposure will be slightly longer, so it won't be quite so much labor intensive. It won't require so many computer resources, but even in broad daylight, it works fairly well. So the next type of filter that I use is an ND filter. This is a graduated ND filter, and that is this. Another filter that you don't necessarily have to buy is this. So this is a 3-stop, soft edge, graduated neutral density filter. Essentially, it allows skies to be darker when the exposure is pretty uneven. You just slide it into the bracket on the front of your camera, align it with the horizon line that you wish, and take a picture. And so all you're doing is taking a single exposure. This isn't, of course, a long exposure, but you can see on the screen here, when I pull it up, that the sky is nicely darkened and it smoothly graduates down to normal exposure down here. Again, the downside to this, of course, is it means you have to carry more gear. Of course, again, like I mentioned, filters tend to be magnets for fingerprints and dust. You do increase your chances of getting flare or other artifacts, especially if the sun is in your image. It does add a few extra layers of complexity and cost. So there are a few other ways you can definitely manage this pretty simply and effectively. So the first one is just going into Lightroom and adding a filter mask. So you can go to Lightroom and you can drop your exposure down. Let's say we're going to do 3 stops, just like the filter. And then you can just drag down a filter like that. And you don't have to do quite so strong, but like that. There you go. And so you have basically the same effect. Now this works really well with a single exposure when your dynamic range isn't too high for your camera to capture, such as this during broad daylight, where the dynamic range of the photo is really well within the means of any modern sensor. The problem becomes when you have a very bright sky and a very dark landscape, say during sunrise or sunset, where you have long dark shadows and a very bright sky. That's when you really need a neutral density filter, graduated neutral density filter, to kind of compensate for that difference. Now, of course, the other thing you can do is shoot in HDR, but not all images really work with an HDR. So instead of doing that, another really easy way to replicate a filter, you can take a single exposure at a normal exposure duration. So this is the same as all the other pictures at ISO 100, 24 millimeters, f11, 1/200th of a second. And you can take a second picture at the same ISO and the same focal length and the same f-stop. And the only thing you need to change here is your shutter speed. And so if we hop back over to Photoshop, we would select both of these, edit in, open as layers in Photoshop, just as if we were doing the merge before, but this time it's just 2 layers. So we'll hop into Photoshop, and that's this right here. The key, this is your bright layer, this is your dark layer, And you can see there's a bit of motion here. This is normally not going to happen, but I took a little bit extra time because I was talking to the camera. So you don't want to take too long in between, otherwise you will see a little bit of motion blur there. But real simple, you just select the darker layer, make sure it's on top. You're going to create a mask. Go to your gradient, make sure it's white to black. Drag down, hold the shift key to make sure it's a straight line. You can see it kind of locks to the degree mark there. And boom. The nice thing about this is you can sort of edit exactly where you want your gradient filter to exist. So something like that works pretty well. The nice thing about doing it in Lightroom as a single photo is that you can use a luminance mask to mask out the trees and have a nice clean line. Here you can see that the trees do get a little bit darker on the top, and that's something that happens the same exact way in real life if you're using an actual graduated neutral density filter. The big difference here is I can actually edit this mask pretty easily just by using the brush tool. You can either hit B for brush or click on the brush tool. You want to make sure that you're using black to conceal. And I'll do this real quick. Normally I would take my time with this, but you can see you can actually mask back in the trees and use a smooth edge there, and you'd actually end up with a nice clean mask line of the tree. You can also do a selection and do it that way if you want to as well. So that's another easy way to do it. But that gives you a nice clean mask. It's easy to manipulate. And the nice thing about that is you can underexpose your sky as much as you need to. So if you don't have, say, a 6 or 7 stop neutral density filter, you can just, expand your exposure and have a wider range of light than even with a neutral density filter. So it really does give you a pretty big advantage. And the other thing to think about is that you can actually, in this case, expand the exposure with a long exposure. So you could do a long exposure with the ground and then have a fast exposure do a long exposure with the sky and have a fast exposure with the ground for something like breaking waves, where you wouldn't want your waves to be completely missed. They wouldn't be completely smoothed out by the neutral density filter. That would be a really great way to show that. Again, a filter plus a holder, over $100. But again, what if we were to not use the filter and instead just use a little bit of photo trickery back in Photoshop? So I've removed the graduated neutral density filter. I'm back to my base settings, ISO 100 at 1/200th of a second at f11. I'm going to take a picture. But instead, I'm going to raise my exposure speed by 3 stops. And take another picture. And then we're going to blend them back in Photoshop. So basically that's about it. I got some people up in the chat, so I'm going to hop into the chat room real quick and say hello. It's pretty cool to do this live. Really happy that you would all be able to join us. All right, back into Lightroom here. Just going to show you the last little result. So like I was saying, basically the 3 ways you can do these exposures: standard with a neutral density filter, 10, 12, 16. I think there's a few out there that are like 20 stop, but you do end up with color casts, which is another thing. Anytime you put a piece of glass in front of your lens, you always run the risk of dealing with color casts, etc., etc. That's why I really like the stacked image approach instead. Is it's just your lens. You can use the lens hood no problem. You can do everything you need to do without interfering with the qualities of your lens. So if you spend all this money on glass to have a really high quality lens, and then you put a cheap filter in front of it, it's really a waste of money. And so just a few other things to consider. I would not waste your money on one of these. This is, and if I can open it without making a mess because the box is really in bad shape. This is just a UV filter. You can see this one is rather disgusting because I never use it. It's been sitting in my storage bin for quite a long time. It's glass. It's nice quality. Costs fairly inexpensive, 50-60 bucks for one of these in a regular size. I think this is a 67 millimeters. Yeah, 67 millimeter filter. This is clear. A lot of folks put these on. This was really popular in the film days because it would prevent you from getting UV spillage into your film. Some film was sensitive to UV light, and so you'd end up with weird colors. Of course, film got better and that problem went away, but people kept buying these out of habit, and because camera store salesmen love to sell these things because they're a good profit margin and it's an easy upsell, because who wants ruined colors? Well, then obviously we switched over to digital. Digital doesn't have the same issue with UV, so they started selling these instead as skylight filters that protect the front of your lens. But if you're using a lens hood, like a tulip hood or a regular lens hood, you don't need this because this doesn't add anything for your lens. And unless you're really mistreating your camera or in terrible weather conditions, this is just a waste of money. Something that's not a waste of money, if you shoot astrophotography like I tend to do, this weird looking purple, I don't know if you can see that, yep, is a light pollution filter. It actually helps remove the orange sodium vapor glow from cities when you're taking pictures at night. Again, there's some positives to that, and that really does give you a better night sky color. Some negatives, it turns everything in the landscape a little bit of a weird color, so I would again kind of consider doing exposure blending. Take a picture of the landscape without the filter, screw the filter on, take a picture of the night sky and blend them in post. The downside also is any bright lights in your scene are going to cause ghosting or flaring, just like any other piece of glass. It just doesn't do a good job as a regular bare lens does at preventing that. But it is a valuable tool if you shoot a lot of nighttime photography. The last filter that I'll talk about is going to be a circular polarizer filter, and it's the single most important filter you can own. It's the only one that I would say is an absolute necessity for every photographer because there's nothing that really duplicates it in post. You can make a long exposure without taking a filter into the field. You can do graduated neutral density filter without taking one into the field, but you can't mimic the effects of a polarizer without an actual polarizer. Now, there's some photography processing software that sort of mimics it, etc., but it's not really the same thing. And so I really strongly encourage you, if you're taking pictures of landscape, especially things like fall color, if you really want your fall color to pop, definitely consider putting a circular polarizer on your lens, because the blue sky actually impacts the color of the flowers and the leaves in your fall color pictures. And so you end up with a bluish tint on your leaves that you would be able to eliminate if you just use that circular polarizer. So definitely something that you want to consider. Hop back over to chat to see if we have anybody else. Not at this time. All right. So that is about it for me today. Thank you all for joining me. I really enjoy doing these live videos. If you like them as well, please consider giving me a subscribe, thumbs up if you'd like, and don't forget to ring that bell so you get notified for any upcoming videos. And it's not playing. Okay. All right. Well, thanks again for watching, and bye.